Imagine this. A young man from a small Swedish town with no university degree, no inheritance, and no special privileges would one day change the way the entire world shops for clothes. His idea was so powerful, it created an empire worth tens of billions and reshaped the fashion industry forever. But behind his success lies a story of obsession, risk, and a system that would eventually raise serious questions about how we consume fashion today. This is the story of Erling Persson, the founder of H&M. Erling Persson was born in 1917 in the industrial town of Västerås, Sweden. It was a place of smoke, factories, and working-class families struggling to get by. This was not the glamorous Sweden of IKEA catalogs and stylish designs we know today. This was a Sweden where survival meant discipline, where families lived modestly, and ambition was often beaten down by circumstance. Erling's father was a cheesemaker, not a wealthy businessman, but a small shop owner, carving out a living from dairy. Their family wasn't destitute, but they were far from comfortable. Every coin mattered. Every sale mattered. The Perssons lived simply, and from a young age, Erling understood the value of work. His father's cheese shop was small, but to Erling, it was a classroom. He watched carefully as his father served customers, noticed their behavior, and picked up lessons no textbook could ever teach. Unlike many future tycoons, Persson didn't come from a background of privilege. He didn't attend elite universities. His formal education was modest, but his real education came from watching, from studying, from noticing the smallest details in human behavior, how a customer's eyes lingered on certain products, how pricing influenced decisions, how trust between shopkeeper and buyer could mean the difference between loyalty or losing business forever. To Erling, these weren't just interactions, they were signals, clues to the bigger puzzle of commerce. By his teenage years, Erling was already finding ways to make money of his own. Small trades, errands, and odd jobs. Nothing glamorous, but everything was practice. He learned that money wasn't just earned, it was negotiated, persuaded, sold. Even when the sums were tiny, the lessons were huge. Other kids may have been content with play. Erling was restless.
But I want it now!
He wanted to understand how the world of business worked, why some people succeeded while others remained trapped in struggle. To him, these were not abstract questions. They were urgent. The 1920s and 30s were not easy decades for Sweden. The Great Depression rippled across the globe. Even countries that avoided the worst effects still felt the pressure. Jobs were scarce, families cut back. And for young Erling, this only deepened the lessons of scarcity and resourcefulness. When you grow up in an environment where nothing is guaranteed, you learn to make something out of nothing. Persson didn't dream in abstractions. He dreamed in practical steps. How to survive, how to get by, how to find opportunity where others saw none. Over time, Persson developed an unusual skill. He could break down the mechanics of selling into pieces. Why did some items sell faster? Why did others sit unsold? What made a customer hesitate? What made them say yes? These weren't just observations, they were experiments. Every day in his father's shop was like running a laboratory in psychology and commerce. And slowly, Erling realized something most people never think about. Success in business doesn't come from the product itself, but from the system around it. The pricing, the turnover, the timing, the way customers felt when they entered the shop. The cheese may have been simple, but the lessons were profound.
Nice.
What made Persson different from many others in Västerås was not just that he worked hard. Everyone worked hard. It was that he saw the world differently. Where others saw limits, he saw inefficiencies. Where others accepted tradition, he questioned it. Why did shops need to charge so much? Why couldn't everyday people have access to more? These weren't yet the seeds of a fashion empire, but they were the beginnings of a mindset. A mindset that valued scale over scarcity, access over exclusivity, efficiency over tradition. By 1945, Erling Persson was still just a small-town Swede. No empire, no global recognition. But he was armed with something far more powerful than wealth: experience. 2 decades of quiet observation, relentless curiosity, and a hunger for opportunity. He had studied people, money, and systems in the most practical way possible. He was ready, even if he didn't yet know it. The stage was set, and in 1946, a single journey would ignite everything. Persson would step off a ship in America and see a vision that would change fashion forever. In 1946, the war had ended. Europe was rebuilding, and Erling Persson, now 29 years old, was restless. For nearly 3 decades, he had lived in Västerås, studying commerce through the lens of a cheese shop. He understood people, pricing, and persuasion, but he had yet to find the idea that would define him. That year, he boarded a ship bound for the United States. He didn't know it at the time, but what he saw there would ignite the spark that built an empire. For Persson, America was overwhelming. In Sweden, shopping was practical, modest. But in the United States, shopping was an event. Stores were vast, shelves overflowed, and most shocking of all, fashion wasn't exclusive anymore. Even ordinary working-class Americans were buying stylish clothes at affordable prices. He walked through department stores in New York and Chicago, and what he saw left him stunned. Clothing was being sold like food, constantly rotated, cheaply priced, designed to move quickly. It wasn't about scarcity or luxury, it was about scale. And in this system, every customer felt included. When Persson returned to Sweden in 1947, he had a decision to make. He couldn't copy the American system directly. Sweden was smaller, more conservative, and less wealthy, but he could adapt it. The question was, where to start? He chose women's clothing, and here's why. First, women were the most consistent shoppers. They bought not just for themselves, but often for entire households. Second, women's fashion changed faster than men's. A man in 1947 could wear the same suit for a decade, but women's clothing was seasonal, emotional, driven by trends. It meant repeat business, faster turnover, and more sales per year.
Let me put it in a language you can understand.
Persson understood. If you wanted to build a system, you didn't start with stability. You started with demand. And women's fashion was demand in motion. In Västerås, that same year, Persson opened his first store. He called it hennes, the Swedish word for hers. It was small, simple, but it was revolutionary. Clothes weren't displayed as luxury pieces behind glass. They were stacked, hung, easy to touch, easy to buy. Prices were low enough that ordinary women could afford multiple outfits. Fashion, for the first time in Sweden, felt democratic. At first, competitors laughed. They said Persson's clothes were too cheap, too ordinary. But the customers didn't care. They weren't buying status. They were buying access, and they loved it. But hennes wasn't just a store. It was a system. Persson used every lesson from America and every observation from his father's cheese shop. Cheap supply, fast turnover, a constant sense of freshness. If something didn't sell quickly, it was removed, replaced, rotated. Customers were trained to know that every visit meant something new. If they hesitated, the product might be gone forever. But the rise of hennes wasn't effortless. Sweden in the late 1940s was cautious. Post-war shortages meant Persson had to be clever with sourcing. Fabrics weren't always abundant. Customers weren't always ready to embrace something new. And Persson didn't have endless cash. Every krona mattered. Every decision carried risk. What most stories leave out is how fragile those first years were. Persson wasn't building an empire yet. He was just trying to keep the lights on. But what kept him going was conviction, that he had glimpsed the future in America, and if he could adapt it to Sweden, the rewards would be immense. Through the 1950s, hennes grew, Slowly at first, then faster. Persson opened new stores in Swedish towns, each one refining the model. He expanded not with luxury, but with efficiency. His shops weren't glamorous, but they were busy. The formula worked because it wasn't about prestige. It was about numbers, about moving product quickly, reliably, and consistently. By the early 1960s, Hennes had become a recognized chain across Sweden. Customers didn't think of it as cheap clothing anymore. They thought of it as accessible clothing. And that psychological shift, from cheapness to accessibility, was Persson's genius. By 1967, Hennes was a successful national chain. But Persson was restless again. He knew the model could go further, yet something was missing. His stores only catered to women. Half the population, the men, were untouched. And Erling Persson wasn't the kind of man to leave half the market on the table. The next step would require boldness. In 1968, he would make a move that would change the brand forever. But before that moment, Hennes was still just hers. (1968) Sweden. Erling Persson had spent 2 decades building something that didn't just sell clothing. It sold access. But his empire had a flaw. It was half-finished. Hennes, which meant hers, served women faithfully. But the other half of society? The men? They were untouched. Persson knew that if Hennes wanted to become a true giant, it couldn't stay one-sided forever. That same year, an opportunity appeared. In Stockholm, there was a store called Moritz Widfors. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fashionable. It was a men's hunting and outdoor equipment shop. They sold rugged jackets, boots, and gear for the wilderness. But most importantly, they had something Persson desperately needed: a strong supply of men's clothing stock. In 1968, Persson bought Moritz Widfors outright, and with that, he merged the two worlds: Hennes for women and Moritz for men. The new name? Hennes och Moritz, or simply H&M. What Persson built after 1968 wasn't just another clothing store. It was the first prototype of the modern fast fashion machine. Think about it. H&M wasn't a luxury boutique. It wasn't a traditional tailor. It was a constantly churning cycle. New clothes came in, old clothes went out. Women's clothing updated with every season. Men's clothing provided balance, steady sales, and access to an entirely new audience. Persson's system was simple, but deadly effective. Clothes were produced cheaply. Styles changed rapidly. Stock was constantly rotated. Customers were trained to shop often, not once or twice a year, but every few weeks. This wasn't shopping anymore. It was a cycle. And once you were in, you stayed in.
A few moments later.
Through the 1970s, H&M exploded. The merger had doubled the audience overnight. But Persson didn't just rely on that. He began expanding stores across Sweden and then beyond. By the mid-70s, H&M stores were appearing in Norway, Denmark, and the UK. Each new store followed the formula: affordable, trendy, fast. But here's the detail most stories skip. H&M didn't just succeed because of low prices. It succeeded because Persson understood something psychological. He knew that clothing wasn't just fabric, it was identity. And people's identities change constantly. One month, they wanted to look sophisticated, the next month casual, the next month bold. H&M gave them the ability to reinvent themselves cheaply, again and again. Persson wasn't selling clothes. He was selling transformation, on demand. But with growth came ruthlessness. Suppliers were pressured to produce faster, cheaper. Inventory was scrutinized. Every product was measured not by its beauty, but by how quickly it sold. If it didn't move, it was killed. Persson's empire wasn't sentimental. It was mechanical, and that's why it scaled. Persson once said, "Fashion is for everyone, not just the rich." That line wasn't just branding. It was his mission. He believed clothing should be democratic. But beneath that noble vision was also a sharp reality. Democratizing fashion meant monetizing volume, millions of customers, millions of purchases, and billions in revenue.
I'm rich! Hey!
Through the 70s, trends shifted constantly. Hippie fashion, disco style, punk influence. But H&M adapted each time. That was Person's secret weapon. He didn't try to predict fashion. He just reacted to it faster than anyone else. By the time competitors caught up, H&M was already on to the next wave. By 1982, Person had done what few men in retail history had ever achieved. He had turned a small women's store in Westeros into an international clothing empire. From hers to his to everyone's, H&M had become a cultural force. That year, Person stepped down as CEO, handing the reins to his son, Stefan Person. It was the end of an era, but the machine he built, it was only just beginning. On the 28th of October 2002, Erling Pearson passed away at the age of 85. For most people, death is the end of their story. But for Pearson, it was only the beginning of a much larger one. Because by then, H&M was no longer just a Swedish clothing chain. It was an empire, a global machine, a story that had already outgrown the man who started it in a tiny cheese shop town. Long before Erling's death, he had already prepared for succession. In 1982, he handed the CEO role to his son, Stefan Pearson. The handover wasn't just about bloodline, it was about continuity. Stefan had grown up watching his father build Hennes & Mauritz from the ground up. But unlike Erling, Stefan had a different ambition. He didn't just want Sweden, he wanted the world. By the time Stefan took control, H&M already had 84 stores. Sales were strong, but what he engineered next would shock the retail world. Under Stefan's leadership, H&M went global. By the 1990s, H&M had entered Germany, the UK, France, and the Netherlands. Sales exploded from a few billions to tens of billions. By the year 2000, H&M had nearly 700 stores worldwide and annual sales of over $5 billion. To put that into perspective, Erling had started with one small boutique in Westeros. Within half a century, it had become one of the largest fashion chains in the world. And this growth wasn't slowing down. Today, H&M is a colossus. Over 4,200 stores across more than 70 countries. Annual revenue surpassing $20 billion. And with subsidiaries like COS, Monkey, and Weekday, the empire extends far beyond the red H&M logo. But beyond the numbers, Person's story teaches lessons about business and about life. Lesson 1. Observe the world. Person's empire began not in Sweden, but in the streets of New York, when he noticed something others ignored. Lesson 2. Adapt faster than the competition. He didn't invent fashion. He simply delivered it quicker, cheaper, and wider. Lesson 3. Democratize value. Person understood that the richest markets aren't always the richest customers. They're the masses who crave access. Yet there's another side to the empire. The fast fashion machine Person pioneered has been criticized for its environmental cost, its labor conditions, and its throwaway culture. H&M has faced lawsuits, protests, and global scrutiny. The same system that made fashion accessible also made it disposable. And that paradox, accessibility versus sustainability, remains the company's greatest challenge today. In 2025, H&M remains one of the largest clothing retailers in the world, competing with Zara, Shein, and Uniqlo. The Person family still controls the empire, with Stefan's son, Carl Johan Person, having served as CEO. Their fortune? Tens of billions. The company's market value? Over $20 billion. Erling Person didn't look like a revolutionary. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He started with nothing, in a poor family, in a small town. But by watching, by learning, and by daring to adapt, he built a company that changed how the entire world buys clothes. From hers, to his, to everyone's. H&M became not just a brand, but a cultural machine. And it all began with one man, standing in New York, staring into a shop window, realizing that fashion could belong to everyone.